to our colleagues at the Romanian Cultural Institute, and most specifically to Vladimir Tismaneanu at the University of Maryland, who really put this conference together, along with Bogdan Jakob. He's there as well. So thanks to all of you for this conference. Past conferences are, over the past years, are now solidifying into volumes to be published by CU Press, I believe. I don't know when the next one will be out.
November, actually today.
Today, well, even more appropriate then that we acknowledge this and have this conference. So we are very pleased and we're privileged to have as our keynote speaker today Professor Timothy Snyder with a keynote address on European mass killing and European commemorations. Dr. Snyder received his doctorate from the University of Oxford, where he was a British Marshall Scholar. He has held fellowships in Paris and Vienna, and at the an Academy Scholarship at Harvard. He's the author of a good number of books, including Nationalism, Marxism, and Modern Central Europe, a biography of Kazimierz Keles-Krauss, The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, 1569 to 1999, Sketches from a Secret War, a Polish artist's mission to liberate the Soviet Union, The Red Prince, The Secret Lives of a Habsburg Archduke, and most recently, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. We were fortunate to launch this book here earlier this week at a Kennan Institute forum, and we're even more delighted to feature him here today. He's promised not to repeat anything that he said on the 10th here in the Kennan forum. So with that, let me give him the floor, and again, I wish us a productive and wonderful second day to this important conference. Thank you so much.
Christian, thanks so much for the introduction. What I'd like to do is take my own title very literally. The title is European Mass Killing and European Commemoration. Those are two very different subjects. The history of mass killing is one subject, and the commemoration of the history of mass killing is a very different subject. I'd like to divide this talk, timing myself, I'd like to divide this talk between those two subjects, emphasizing that they are different, and then perhaps at the very end making some modest suggestions about how they ought to be brought together. So this is in a way a talk about the last 20 years of my own work, which on the one hand involved an attempt to bring together German and Soviet policies of mass killing in Eastern Europe in the book which Christian was kind enough to mention, Bloodlands, and at the same time was a rich period of commemoration of Soviet and also of German crimes in the region in which I was working. This is something that we've all experienced as we try to work on the history of the 20th century. Simultaneously around us, that history is being commemorated. So I'm going to begin with reflections about the killing itself, and then move to a kind of analysis of why commemoration, or to put it in a way which is almost oxymoronic, satisfactory commemoration, has been so terribly difficult in the region with which we're concerned in this conference. I want to be clear about something right away. What I'll be talking about in the first part of the book, the first part of the talk, is the history of deliberate mass killing. That is to say, policies by which leaders deliberately killed large numbers of people. this is distinct from the history of the camps, although it's related. It's distinct from demographic analyses of losses, which is a rather vague term used a lot, which includes children who might have been born, had something terrible not happened. There are other metrics that one could use. I'd just like to be clear that what I'm talking about, or will be talking about, is mass killing. And what I've noticed in the years in which I was working on this subject is something rather striking, namely that through all the space and all the time when the Nazi and the Soviet systems functioned, the huge majority of the deliberate killing happened at a certain time and a certain place. And that time is between 1933 and 1945, when both Hitler and Stalin were in power. And that place is what I call in the book the Bloodlands, namely most of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, and the Baltics. The regimes together, and we can talk about these numbers if you'd like, but the regimes together deliberately killed about 17 million people. Of those 17 million, 14 million were in the Bloodlands in this time and place. The density of this horror authorized me to take this as the premise for the book. I'd like to emphasize that in my mind, and I realize there's some disagreement about this, the numbers are extremely important. If we agree, as I think we all do, that the difference between 0 deaths and 1 death is very significant, and we don't have to think very long to agree with that, then we also have to agree that the difference between 700,000 and 700,001 deaths is equally significant. I'm not going to claim that we will ever know these numbers with that kind of precision. What I would say, though, is that the numbers are important because every big number is a multiple of 1. And although we can never reach perfection, I think we ought to be as careful with these big numbers as we would be with small numbers, and to care about them for the same reasons that we care about the small numbers, only more so. So, when you look at the history in this way, when you take this time and place as your platform, as your premise, what do you find? You find the following 6 or 7 major events, which comprise this total of 14 million deliberate killings. The first is the famine in Soviet Ukraine. In general, what you see when you look at this period is that Soviet killing dominates in the 1930s. Then there's a period between 39 and 41 when the Soviets and the Germans are allies, and they're killing in much the same way and in much the same rate. And then there's a period from 1941 to 1945 when almost all of the deliberate killing is done by the Germans. So this period begins with a Soviet action. It's a distinct Soviet action. Of course, it has something to do with Germany in the sense that Adolf Hitler refers to it in his electoral campaign in the spring of 1933. But the famine in Soviet Ukraine is a result of a Soviet policy of collectivization, which we now know was deliberately manipulated in the summer and especially the fall of 1932, such that 3 million people in Ukraine would die. The record of Stalin's correspondence over this period and the record of Politburo meetings over this period is clear enough for us to know that Stalin knew what would happen and pursued policies such as blockading settlements, taking meat, closing the borders of the Soviet Ukrainian Republic, that he knew would lead to mass death. And in fact, the way that he and Kaganovich talk about it makes clear that they know that this is what was coming. And one of the reasons why they knew it, by the way, was because of what had just happened in Kazakhstan, where a famine which killed an even larger number of the population proportionately had taken place between 1930 and 1931. Often the way this argument is presented is the following way, that if Kazakhstan happened, then there must not have been something particular about Ukraine. I see this exactly the opposite. Precisely because Kazakhstan happened in 30 and 31, the Soviet leadership knew what a combination of policies would bring in 1932 and 1933 and pursued them deliberately. And to be absolutely clear about this, the food which was exported would have saved almost all of the Ukrainians and others who died in 1932 and 1933. Access to grain stockpiles would have saved almost all of them. Simply not fulfilling requisition targets would have saved almost all of them. So this was a deliberate policy. And it also, to be clear about this as well, had a political backdrop. There was a political rationale. The political rationale involved imagined plots having to do with Ukrainian nationalists who had supposedly taken control of the Ukrainian branch of the Soviet Communist Party in league with Polish spies and others. So there was a political rationale, there's clear documentation of knowledge, and there's advance of intent, and there's advanced knowledge of what would happen if these policies were pursued. The second stage of the killing in the Bloodlands is that of the Great Terror in the Soviet Union, in which, as we now know, 682,691 people were recorded as having been executed. We know a great deal about the terror that we didn't know 20 years ago. What has not happened is that this particular knowledge hasn't worked its way into the general way that we talk about the Soviet Union. In general, the numbers are smaller than people had generally thought. If the figure I just gave, roughly 700,000, added to the other recorded killings in the 1930s and early 1940s, can get you up to a figure of about 1 million deliberate executions, but not any higher than that. The other thing which we now know about this period in Stalinism is that the parts of the Great Terror that were visible, and here I'm telling colleagues things that they know, and I ask for their forgiveness and patience, but the parts of the Great Terror that were visible, that is the show trials and to some extent the executions of officers, which intelligence agencies at the time had an idea about, are only the tip of the iceberg, and they're very misrepresentative of what actually happened. Party members and military officers were touched in the tens of thousands, but other groups identified as kulaks or as national minorities were touched in the hundreds of thousands. And in particular, the clarity with which the Great Terror touched particular ethnic minorities has only come clear in the last 20 years. The Estonian, Finnish, Latvian, Polish, German, Korean, also Caucasian, and Central Asian actions deliberately targeted national minorities. About 250,000 people were killed predominantly because of who they were, rather than anything they did. And the methods for finding people were often as simple as looking through the phone book for a certain kind of last name. The largest of these actions was the Polish action, in which 110,000 people were shot, essentially for being Poles. The charge was that they were Polish spies. I worked on this from the other end, and for whatever it's worth, I don't think a single one of the people who was executed actually was a Polish spy. That is, I have a sense of who the Polish spies in the Soviet Union were at the time. It would be senseless to deny that another sovereign power didn't have spies in the Soviet Union. But the Soviets managed to kill 110,000 people without actually executing a single one of them. The next stage in the killing in the Bloodlands is the stage when the Soviets and the Germans were allies between 1939 and 1941. From the broad point of view of European history, this period is important, of course, because it's the period when both the Soviets and the Germans are expanding territorially. The Soviets more modestly, trying to invade Finland, incorporating eastern Poland, incorporating northeastern Romania. The Germans much more ambitiously invading the Low Countries and France, beginning the Battle of Britain, fueled, by the way, by quite literally fueled by oil from the Soviet Union at the time, fed by grain coming from the Soviet Union at the time. In terms of our subject of deliberate killing, this is a period when about 200,000 people were killed, roughly in equal numbers by the Soviets and the Nazis, in general targeting the same kinds of groups. For coming from different sorts of analyses, one racial and the other class, both the Soviets and the Germans came to the conclusion that the way to destroy, in the German case, or dominate, in the Soviet case, Poland, was to remove the group which both of them called the intelligentsia. Now, intelligenz in German or intelligentsia in Russian, there are long debates about where that word came from, but what I find interesting, whether it was German first or Russian first or Polish first, but what I find interesting is a kind of convergence between those who destroyed and those who were destroyed, that this group, this intelligentsia, the educated classes, were what was important. And the profiling was so similar that in the number of cases that we now know of, one brother was killed by the Germans and one brother was killed by the Soviets, or one sister was killed by the Germans and another sister was killed by the Soviets, precisely because they were using the same kind of metric. The Soviets, for example, used copies of Who's Who, the Polish Who's Who, in order to decide who were the notable people who had to be arrested, and in many cases executed. The next stage is the most dramatic. That's between 1941 and 1945, when the Germans betray their Soviet allies and invade the Soviet Union. And in order to understand what comes next, one has to have a sense of the scale of destruction which was envisioned by German plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was in fact far greater than anything the Germans managed to achieve, unthinkably horrible though that was. These plans envisioned not only the removal of all of the Jews who fell under German rule, which was a goal from the beginning, their elimination, but also the starvation of some 30 million inhabitants of the Soviet Union after a victorious war in the first winter of the war in 1941. By the way, that would have meant the death of about 3/4 of the Jews in the Soviet Union who lived in the cities who were precisely to be starved, and then, by the way, razed to the ground. That was also part of the plan. The general notion of this plan, which was called the Hunger Plan, was that Soviet modernization, that is, all of the building of cities, all of the urbanization, all of the development that took place in the 20s and 30s, and especially under the first 5-year plan, was to be reversed. The people who came into Soviet cities were to be killed by hunger. The cities themselves were to be removed. Progress was to be undone, and this was to become a kind of German agrarian paradise. That was the foundational idea. The other plan, which is worth recalling, was something called Generalplan Ost, which was a post-war colonization scheme, which envisioned that a further very large number of people, how many depends a bit on what premises you start with, but somewhere between 30 and 50 million people were to be forcibly deported across the Urals, enslaved, assimilated, or killed. So the vision that the Germans had, and these plans, by the way, are in black and white in the spring of 1941. They're much clearer than other sorts of documentation that we have to deal with. The plans that the Germans had were for a transformation that's almost unthinkably murderous and unthinkably radical. And these ideas to demodernize the Soviet Union and the racial and imperial assumptions with which the Germans entered the Soviet Union are necessary to understand some of the policies that indeed followed. The most dramatic of these were the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war. About 2.6 million Soviet prisoners of war were starved to death in death camps which are largely forgotten. Another 500,000 Soviet prisoners of war, predominantly, although not entirely Jews, were also shot at the same time. The starvation siege of Leningrad was not just a military contingency. It was consistent with Hitler's desire, again, which we have in writing, that the city be destroyed. And smaller starvation policies pursued against Kiev and Kharkiv were also pursued against cities which, according to German planning, weren't meant to exist by the end of the war anyway. The most important policy within this phase, although it's so important that it's hard to put it under one heading, are the policies that we describe as the Holocaust. As most of you know, this begins with shooting campaigns in the East, which quickly, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, which quickly become the destruction of women and children, then the elimination of whole communities. By the end of 1941, some 1 million Jews are already dead in the conquered Soviet Union, most of them by gunfire, some of them by gas fans, using a technology which had earlier been used on the handicapped, beginning in 1939. The Holocaust then shifts both in technology and geography. The shooting continues in the East. Death facilities using carbon monoxide are built in occupied Poland. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Helmno is a slightly different initiative, but also should be counted, Majdanek, where, again, close to 3 million Jews are killed. And then the final stage of the killing, the one which is most familiar to us, is Auschwitz. Auschwitz is a bit atypical. It's very important because 1 in 6 Jews who were killed died there. It's atypical in the sense that Soviet Jews, who are the second largest group of Jews killed in the Holocaust, for the most part, don't die at Auschwitz. They die over killing fields. And then Polish Jews, who are the largest group, die in significant numbers in Auschwitz, about 200,000. But for the most part, they die somewhere else. Auschwitz is special because Auschwitz was the gathering point for Jews from southern and western Europe, Hungarian Jews predominantly, in 1942, 43, 44, especially 43, 44. And that's one of the reasons why it's remembered. The other reason why it's remembered particularly is that unusually it was simultaneously a death facility and a concentration camp. The concentration camp had many survivors. The death facility did not. But the concentration camp survivors are the people who were then able to recall for us Auschwitz. It's much harder to recall Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Helmno, because the total number of survivors of those places is somewhere under 100. All right. In the final policy, which is worth recalling, and which is actually related to the Holocaust a bit, is the German policy of reprisals, in quotation marks. In occupied Belarus, well over 300,000 non-Jews were killed in what were categorized as reprisals for partisan actions. In some of these reprisals, please remember the quotation marks, all the women and children were shot, and then the men were taken as forced laborers as a matter of deliberate policy, so that there would be labor in the Reich. the way that the Germans carried out reprisals involved herding people into barns, burning down the barns. It involved mass shooting over pits, which was largely indistinguishable in terms of the technique from what was going on with Jews. In fact, at the same time, the same police and security, the same police units and security divisions would kill Jews one day, partisans the next day. And in many cases, in their own records, they don't bother to distinguish, which means that the record of these two events blurs together. But roughly, we know that more than 300,000 non-Jews, more than 300,000 Jews died in Belarus during the war. So when you take all of these events together, from 1933 to 1945, you reach this total of about 14 million people who are deliberately killed. People are deliberately killed in other policies, but these major policies embrace almost all of the numbers. The people in question are Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, Russians, and others. If you add people who were killed in the bloodlands but don't come from the bloodlands, the largest group would be the Hungarian Jews. There is a distinct but related event, which is in a neighboring territory, which is the murder of Romanian Jews in a distinct policy, which is another 300,000 people. If you add the Gulag and the concentration camps, you add a few more million, but you don't change the basic picture of where and how the killing took place. So, I hope I've succeeded in showing you not only the depth of the destruction and the horror, but also, and now I'm changing subjects, also some of the reasons why this now might be difficult to commemorate. The most obvious point is the simplest one, and I'm going to try hard to make it clear. We don't control time. People who commemorate don't control time. Commemoration is an attempt to fix an event at a certain point and describe it in such a way that it will be remembered in a certain way for the future. However, there is never any possibility of a fresh start. You're always commemorating at some distance in time from the events. And there's a particular problem here. The commemoration of the events that I'm talking about, but which took place between 1933 and 1945, begins, for our purposes anyway, in 1989. And by the time that this commemoration, contemporary commemoration, the subject of our conference, by the time it begins, there are already 45 years of other traditions of commemoration. And when you commemorate, you are always commemorating with or against or alongside the traditions of commemoration that already exist. And I'd like to specify what some of these are. These are going to be very familiar to you. And they were very powerful in 1989. I think they're no less powerful today. And when I speak of these as traditions of commemoration, I'm not trying to say that they're historically false. In each case, in different balances, they weld together historical truth with commemorative success. One of these commemorative traditions is what you might think of as liberation from the West. That the Americans landed at Normandy and ended evil in the world. I'm simplifying a bit, but not too much. This is a view which is very powerful in this world, in more sophisticated in this country, in more sophisticated versions. It also has a great deal of power in the UK. We see it repeated not only in film but also in commemorations of VE Day. There are a lot of problems with this, obviously. One of them is its particular connection in the last 15 years or so with the Holocaust. The idea that we landed in Normandy and somehow that had something to do with the Holocaust is, I think, something which most Americans have come to believe. There are problems with this. One is that we had no Jewish motive at the time. We took no action to save Jews during the war. We didn't liberate any of the places where Jews died in large numbers. The other problem with this, at a different level, is that in order to defeat the Germans at all, we relied upon a power which, at the moment when we allied with them, had killed more people than the Germans had. Now, the Germans changed that over the course of the war, but that's not a part of the story which comes in, and that's important because it keeps the American contribution in perspective. But also it reminds us of the moral compromise which was at the heart of the war. And moral compromise is not the category with which we generally recall the war. A second narrative, equally powerful in a different part of the world, you could call liberation from the East. And the liberation from the East narrative goes like this. The Soviet Union modernized itself and strengthened itself in the 1930s. It succeeded in liberating most of Europe on the basis of heroic efforts from the Germans. Again, this has a kind of core of truth, but there are some problems with it. The modernization of the 1930s involved starving millions of people to death. The terror involved shooting hundreds of thousands of people. In neither case is it at all clear that this prepared the Soviet Union in any material way to win the war. I think a safer argument could be made that, given that Stalin misunderstood the scenario for war, that it weakened the Soviet Union. So the idea that it all somehow makes sense because the Soviets won the war is appealing, but I don't think it's actually very convincing. The scenario also overlooks that the Soviet Union was one of the initiators of the Second World War, at least in Europe. The Second World War in Europe might perhaps have begun in some other way, but the way that it did in fact begin was with an alliance between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. It tends to overlook the Soviet crimes which led to death, which are then counted in the total number of losses that the Soviet Union suffered. And then in contemporary times, the basic problem which this narrative has is that in today's Russia, the distinction is not made often between the Soviet Union and Russia. So most of the losses, but also a lot of the fighting done by soldiers, was not done by Russians. It was done by Soviet citizens. Russia suffered horribly, the territory of today's Russia suffered horribly in the war, incomparably greater than any Western territory, but also incomparably less than, say, Belarus or Ukraine, or for that matter, Poland. And so the confusion between Russia and the Soviet Union allows for or this conflation of the Soviet Union and Russia allows for both the martyrdom and the triumph to be reapportioned in a way which is in fact inaccurate. The third narrative or tradition of commemoration, and this one has a much greater balance in my view of truth to oversimplification that we have and that mattered from 1989 and that matters today, is that of the Holocaust. Now, the history of the Holocaust by 1989, and I would say even more since 1989, has established certain very important facts, and I by no means wish to diminish them. It established the numbers. Hilberg was very close to being right about the total numbers, it looks like, and that was a long time ago. It established very precisely the victim group and how the Jews as a victim were different from other victim groups, that the Germans meant to eliminate all of the Jews, and by the end of the war attempted to kill all of the Jews who were under their control anywhere they were. That makes the Jewish case different. It established, to a great degree of accuracy, the methods by which Jews were killed. And all of this has only improved with time. In the last 20 years, the scholarship on the Holocaust has been remarkable. However, there are certain problems with the way that we have studied the Holocaust in the West, which have made commemoration in the East a bit harder. Let me just try to name them. One of them is that in general, and by in general I mean about 99% of the time, we approach Holocaust history with the sources that are left by the perpetrators, which is incredibly appropriate if you're trying to establish their motives. And the debate about the motives of the Germans and timings of decisions has been, I think, one of the most impressive debates in the history of historiography itself. However, that optic leaves out the terrains where the Holocaust took place, which the Germans themselves understood very imperfectly. And it also leaves out the majority of the victims, 97% of whom couldn't have left a trace in German because they didn't know German. The second problem with the Holocaust tradition as we have it is the over-identification with the West. The victims who we do know well, people like Anne Frank, are people who are atypical victims. Victor Klemperer is a more recent example. These are atypical victims. These are victims from relatively small groups of Jews whose chances for surviving in the German case, although it might seem ironic, were much greater than the chances for survival of Jews elsewhere. And again, there's this epistemic irony that the less deadly was the Holocaust, the more likely we were to learn something about it, because there can be survivors who leave us with memoirs and leave us with novels. The more deadly it was, the harder it is for us to find out things about it. And this is consistent, all of it, with the image which I believe had consolidated by 1989 of Auschwitz as the center of the Holocaust, which again is an important part of the truth. But there are at least two other things which you have to add, namely the carbon monoxide killing facilities in Poland and then the killing fields further east in the occupied Soviet Union, to get a more complete picture. And those things are generally left in the shade of Auschwitz. What this means, I think, is that by 1989, the countries where Jews actually lived in large numbers, and which are the countries where the Holocaust took place, were largely understood in those terms. Why is that? It's because all of the places where the Holocaust actually took place fell behind the Iron Curtain. They became something which was called Eastern Europe. they were studied within a Cold War framework or they were studied within a national framework. But for most people in the West, they simply lost a great deal of the palpable reality they had had before the Second World War. And so they came to be defined as, insofar as they were thought of at all, in terms of these horrible terrains, these cities, these killing fields, these death facilities, where the Holocaust took place. I don't want to overstress this point, but it seems to me that the fact that these countries came to exist chiefly in that capacity in the Western imagination makes it difficult for various kinds of commemoration later on. So, I'm talking about the difficulties of commemoration. This, I think, is one of them. The existence of these other sorts of commemorative traditions. Another source of difficulty, I won't stress. It's all the things we talked about yesterday. The contradictions of democratization and commemoration that Jeff Herf talked about, which I would like to stress are more complicated here than they might have been elsewhere. So, for example, in the case that we're talking about, or that I'm trying to talk about, you have this overlap of two different things that you're trying to commemorate, precisely because in all of these countries you have an overlap of experience with both Nazi and Soviet power. So try to imagine how complicated this is just structurally. You have one system that's in power for 45 years. It ends. And then in some sense you want to commemorate the suffering at the hands of that system, communism. But before that system, there was a bloody occupation during the Second World War. And you would also like to commemorate that, perhaps differently, perhaps different constituents. Making matters worse, that first period of suffering under German occupation has already been commemorated by the second system, the communist system. And any way you commemorate in some sense has to be working with or against the way it's already been commemorated, which among other things has led to a lot of interesting overlaps between nationalism and communism in late communist and in post-communist Eastern Europe. So, and then to make matters even worse, if I haven't already lost you, you can't actually distinguish so cleanly in some of these places between one period of Nazi and one period of Soviet domination, because during the war itself, you very often had both. And so sorting all of this out would be incredibly difficult in the best of circumstances. I would note that the positions that East European countries find themselves with, including with and with respect to the Holocaust, are very hard to sort out within the frameworks which were offered them after 1989, the frameworks of commemoration, namely liberation from the West, liberation from the East, liberation from the Holocaust. Each of these has a certain amount of purchase, and the Holocaust, I think, has the most, but none of them can actually capture this complicated position that East Europeans, including East European Jews still in these countries, found themselves in. So, on this basis, let me try to run through briefly some of the problems that particular countries have found in commemoration, and the commemoration situation generally, the politics of commemoration, in some special cases. What are these special cases? I have in mind Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, the countries that are at the center of what I'm calling the bloodlands today. I'm going to leave out Russia because David's giving a whole paper about it, and the Baltics because Leonidas is giving a whole paper about them. But in any event, these countries are the core of what I'm calling the bloodlands, and most of the killing took place in these countries. So what's happened? Ukraine, if you look at the history, is the country which between 1933 and 1945 suffered the most losses to deliberate killing. At least 7 million people through famine, through Soviet terror, through Soviet citizens dying in German prisoner of war camps, and through the Holocaust. On the territory of contemporary Ukraine, something like 7 million people were killed. There's nothing comparable to that in any European country. And not surprisingly, I think it's been very hard to find some kind of stable commemorative tradition. The problem is made even worse than the Ukrainian case because there are two very powerful and rival stories of the war. One of them is a version of liberation from the East, where the Red Army drives out the Germans. That's the dominant story for most Ukrainians, and understandably. Then there's an alternative story which involves resistance to Soviet power by the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists, which in its own way is understandable in that Ukrainian nationalists did in fact resist with great persistence the Red Army, but it has its own, I won't talk about this for long, but it has its own tensions, like for example that the same people who were involved in that in many cases were involved with the pogroms that were organized by the Germans in summer of 1941, and then in the thousands were involved in the German police that took part in the execution of Jews. So then there are those problems, which of course the other tradition is very happy to point to. The consequence of all this, and I'll be brief about it, is that you have had radical oscillations in memory policy in Ukraine. I don't know if there's anything that could really compare to this without a revolution. So, for example, Stalin was convicted, early this year, Stalin was convicted of the crime of genocide in a Ukrainian appeals court. The dead Joseph Stalin was convicted of genocide along with 4 or 5 other people in Ukrainian appeals court. A few days after that happened, the crime for which he was convicted, which was genocide in the case of the famine, was removed from the presidential website entirely because there was a change of president, because the one president lost elections and another came in. Within another few weeks, you have a statue of Stalin being raised, a new statue of Stalin being put up in Ukrainian cities. And then a few weeks after that, you have a communist put in charge of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance. So you have radical oscillations in memory policy in Ukraine. What has changed, or what is changing now, if we're going to talk about the present in terms of the last few months, is that up until now, and even including under the Yushchenko regime, although Yushchenko had some clear priorities, you had a kind of pluralism in Ukraine, which meant that various kinds of positions could at least be articulated. That pluralism seems to be going under now, which is unfortunate. Okay, second very important case, and perhaps the most complicated case, is Belarus. I said that Ukraine was a territory that suffered the most in the 30s and the 40s together. The territory of Europe that suffered the most during the Second World War was Belarus. Belarus suffered directly from the Holocaust. It suffered disproportionately from the mass murder of Soviet prisoners in German camps. It suffered disproportionately from reprisals. Although Serbs and Poles also suffered, Belarusians suffered most of all. Belarusians, for the most part, believe that they are alone with this history of suffering. And they are right. How many of us have even heard of Stalag 352, or of Mali Trastyanets, or of Operation Herman, or even of the Battle of Bagration, which is arguably the decisive battle in the war? The first 3 are events which claimed huge numbers of innocent civilian lives, and which simply have not found their way even into pretty high-level historical discussions of the war. And yet these are things which Belarusians remember and commemorate. What dominates in Belarus is a version of liberation from the East in the person of Alexander Lukashenko, who himself was raised in the 1970s, which was the time when the Soviet version of liberation from the Germans as legitimation of the regime becomes popular, becomes widespread. David might correct me later, becomes something which is taken for granted. What's interesting in Belarus today is the extent to which Lukashenko is now trying to pass on that very narrative to the next generation, and perhaps will even be successful. The most palpable, if perhaps the most ridiculous instance of that is his illegitimate son Kolya, who is 7 years old, who Lukashenko has mentioned as his preferred successor, and who on the relevant days of commemoration wears a little tiny military uniform, as though, it's absurd enough that Lukashenko pretends to have, who was born in the 50s, early 60s, pretends to have liberated the Soviet Union, but that his 7-year-old son liberated the Soviet Union is taking the whole thing another step. But you can see, and I'm emphasizing Gail Kligman's very important point about generations, you can see how this is being transmitted, or the attempt is being made to transmit it. In this narrative of liberation from the East, there is very little room for the Holocaust. Belarus is one of the very few countries where you could even compare non-Jewish to Jewish losses during the Second World War in numbers, not in proportions, but in absolute numbers. Nevertheless, the Holocaust is a crucial event in Belarus. The way that this works is that Jewish citizens are counted as Belarusian citizens, just as they used to be counted as Soviet citizens. Therefore, the Holocaust is molded into a larger story of the suffering of Belarusian civilians, which has enough appeal that most people would simply accept it. This is done explicitly. Lukashenko has a court historian, and the court historian issues his verdicts on things like this. And one of his verdicts is that it is unjust to take into account ethnicity when counting victims of the war. And of course, once you say that, what you're saying is that it's unjust to actually distinguish the Holocaust from other things. The other important thing about the way this narrative functions is that it's anti-Western. It's much more anti-Polish than it is anti-German, because it's more convenient to be anti-Polish than it is to be anti-German. But it's what it does is it presents Belarus as being sort of on the vanguard of protecting civilization. This is a kind of Western narrative à rebours. The barbarians are in the West, and we in Belarus are the ones who are protecting Russia from the aggression of the West. This particular story makes it very hard to imagine. It's one of the many things which makes it very hard to imagine that Belarusian foreign policy could change anytime soon. However, I would point out that there are weaknesses of this commemorative policy, and that a better discussion of history might exploit them. But I'll try to get to that in the conclusion. The third case is Poland. Poland suffers between the 30s and the 40s in lots of ways. Some of them are forgotten. Even Poles do not remember the Polish action of 1937 to 1938. There's no commemoration of this in Poland, even though 4 times as many people were killed as in the Katyn massacres. In 39 to 41, there was the social decapitation of which I spoke. Then there was the Holocaust, which touched above all Polish citizens. There were reprisals. At least 120,000 Polish civilians were killed during the Warsaw Uprising. There were concentration camps and forced labor and so on. What has Polish memory policy been like? I can't really summarize. There have been a couple of bright moments, unusually bright moments. One of them were the Polish-Ukrainian discussions about ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, which had the very interesting feature, which I would recommend for similar attempts at scholarly reconciliation, which was that you had a scholarly conference of Ukrainians and Poles. Both sides, to put it mildly, did not feature historians who you couldn't accuse of nationalism. But the way the format was set up was that each historian had to give a paper under the same title. So a Polish-Ukrainian historian had to give a paper under a title. An Ukrainian historian presenting right after him, they were all men, had to give a paper on that same title, which meant that each of them used the sources that he knew the other was going to use. The consequence of which was that the papers ended up being much more reasonable and scholarly than one might have expected. And you had 9 volumes of publication, which was in fact pretty good. The other high point of Polish commemoration, I think, was the debate after the publication of Jan Gross's book Jedwabne, Neighbors, about Jedwabne, which after a 6-month delay after the publication led to the densest, I think, discussion of the Holocaust which has ever taken place in any country, and it led to a huge jump upward in general Polish knowledge about the Holocaust, including things which had nothing to do with Jedwabne or were only tangentially related, like people being able to say where Treblinka was and what Treblinka meant. The problem with both of these discussions, there were many problems, but I'm going to focus on one for our purposes. The problem with both of these discussions about Ukrainian Polish ethnic cleansing and about Jedwabne was what I would call agency inflation. That in both of these cases, Ukrainians and Poles, in the first case, tended to talk about the Second World War as though it were chiefly about Ukrainians and Poles, and as though Ukrainians and Poles had more to do with what actually happened than in fact they did, which is understandable within the framework of national history. In national history, you tend to shift from being an agent to being a victim, but even when you're a victim, you want to be an agent as much as you can. The same holds for the Jedwabne debate, which, of course, it's incredibly important that Jan pointed out that Poles had killed Jews, and then this led to important other research which established a couple of dozen other sites where this happened. But as German historians have pointed out since, this was part of a larger policy of self-cleansing which the Germans were carrying out using locals. And while Polish participation is morally incredibly important, the debate lost some of the larger context, which I think is actually necessary to understand the true horror of it all. Poland is also exemplary of a particular problem which has spread throughout Eastern Europe, and that is the problem of the memory ministries, the extremely well-funded government instances who are charged with functions which perhaps do not all go together beautifully. Control of critical archives, prosecuting criminals, lustration, which is the review of applicants for political positions in terms of a communist past, and also public education. Now, arguably, it might be a good idea to separate some of those functions, because when they're together in one institution, as they are in the Polish model, and then the Ukrainian model, which is a kind of crazy cousin of the Polish model, when you bring them all together, you create endless possibilities for abuse. Even in scholarly terms, and I'll just cite an example of this. After Jan Gross published his book, Neighbors, there was a 2-volume publication by the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, the IPN, called Volkovnego, which was the best treatment of the subject. It was excellent in terms of documentation, in terms of analysis. It is what brought to light and confirmed all of these other cases which were like Jedwabne. That, in my view, was the high point. However, change of leadership, change of regime, change of government. And a few years later, Jan Gross writes another book called Fear, to which the reaction is preemptive. A Polish book comes out ahead of the publication of Jan's book, with a preface which misleads readers about what the subject of Jan's book is going to be, let alone what actually happened at Kielce, the pogrom at Kielce being the subject of his book. So there have also been some other strange features. Like I remember very fondly when a friend and colleague from Poland wrote me and said, I'm looking forward to sharing a prison cell with you and with other friends, because a law had just been passed about defaming the Polish nation. It turned out that if you claimed that the Polish nation had been involved in either National Socialism or communism, you were committing a crime, which of course would have meant that many people in this room would would have been imprisoned. And I mean, the way I read the law, even if you said one person had done something, you would be committed. And Jan Gross there was actually a prosecutor who had the idea of trying to convict Jan Gross of this. That never came to anything, happily. But something which is particular about Poland and different that distinguishes Poland from Ukraine and Belarus, and which I'd like to stress, is something that you might think of as, for lack of a better word, normality. This is a country of economic success. This is a country which has joined the European Union. But what normality has brought with it is a couple of strange consequences. And one of them, again, to return to Gail Kligman's point, is generation. You now have a young generation of Poles who, in many cases, are not that concerned with the past insofar as the past is a way to get rid of those annoying people above them who might have had some dealings with the communist regime, which, of course, in some way or another, everybody over 45 did in some way or another, because it was a communist system. But young people who very often, in my mind, would have been 30 years ago the very people who would have joined the party for opportunistic reasons are now very much in favor of lustration for the same opportunistic reasons, that it would help them clear out the people who were above them. So that's something which comes with normality. Another paradoxical thing which comes with normality is that joining the European Union, in my opinion, leads to greater irresponsibility in commemoration policy. Here's why. When you're trying to join the European Union, it's necessary for you to be good. It's necessary for you not to have scandals about, for example, the Holocaust, at least not to reply to those scandals in a way which is going to make your candidacy look worse. I'm simplifying somewhat, but this is, I think, the general drift of things. However, once you're actually within the European Union, you can do what every other European Union member does and treat history entirely as your own internal affair. And therefore, your scandals can become national, they can become local. And it doesn't matter. You're not going to be expelled from the European Union for your history discussions any more than Portugal or Greece is going to be expelled for their history discussions. So, ironically, the level of Polish discussion of difficult historical events has gone down since 2004, when Poland joined the European Union. Okay, so to sum up, what then are the limits of commemoration of the event of mass killing which I tried to describe? Because obviously, if I'm right that it's fair and reasonable to describe European mass killing as this one long event with certain important episodes such as the Holocaust, if I'm right to describe it in that way, or if anything like that is correct, we have to observe that nothing like this is being commemorated. There's not even vaguely this kind of transnational commemoration, let alone commemoration of events, as opposed just to just selected groups. Why is that? Well, again, there are the obvious problems that were discussed yesterday, which are inherent to all of this. There is the problem that the outside narratives that existed, liberation from the West, liberation from the East, the Holocaust, offered limited help to countries who were trying to pursue national commemoration policies. There's also something a little bit more subtle, which is that there has not been since 1989, and maybe Jeff or others will correct me, but I could be wrong. I don't think so. There has not been since 1989 a second wave of German commemoration of another group of German victims. So the Holocaust commemoration narrative in Germany has, if anything, I think, become crisper in the last 20 years. However, the turn that has been made in Germany has been more towards, we have our groups of victims now, as well, which we would now like to have discussed in some way. And this point is made more or less politely and more or less correctly. There has not been a move to integrate or to add for example, prisoners of war. Now, of course, educated Germans know that 3.1 million, very educated Germans, know that 3.1 million prisoners of war were deliberately killed by the Germans. But that group has not been brought in to a larger German story, which has been enabled. Polish victims also are, to a large extent, not brought in or added to this story. Had that happened in the last 20 years, I think it would have been easier to commemorate in Eastern Europe, but it hasn't really happened. Another outside limit, or another thing which hasn't happened, is that rather than Russia developing a Russian historical policy, Russia has, unsurprisingly, I think, modified Soviet narratives. If Russia had pulled back in and concerned itself with events that took place on the terrain of the Russian Federation, Ukraine and Belarus and Poland would have had an easier time. But that's not what has happened. Russia, I suppose predictably, has instead worked within the framework of the Soviet narrative of the war and the Soviet narrative of suffering and modified it in certain ways. But the fact that there is a kind of martyrological imperialism going on, where in typical official Russian proclamations, the victims who are being discussed lived well beyond the territory of today's Russian Federation, makes it hard because you have you have victims who are being claimed by numbers of states at the same time. So, for example, a West Ukrainian victim of the Holocaust could be simultaneously claimed by 4 or 5 different states, counting 4 or 5 different ways. Then the final reason why I think this has all been so difficult is much more structural, and this is where I really will end. And that is that all of these states, insofar as they are commemorating within national frameworks, just like we do, and that's my Western we, just like the French do, just like the Americans do, just like the British do. One of the reasons why even the Holocaust, which is a multinational event, but the whole range of killing in the Bloodlands, if you accept my framework, which is also a multinational event, one of the reasons why this cannot be commemorated very well is that commemoration is taking place within national frameworks. Again, in the East, just like in the West. And so I'd like to close by making some recommendations, not about what East Europeans should do, because I think that's always rather too easy, but about what people in the West might do to make commemoration policies a little bit less unsatisfactory. The first is, this is where I say my word of thanks to the Romanian Cultural Institute, the Romanian Embassy, and to Bogdan and Vladimir personally for organizing a conference of this sort. In general, money which is available for commemoration is not used for multinational conferences. I have only mentioned the word Romania in this talk once, now twice, and I'm not going to mention it again. And I think it's very important that discussions of memory and history take on a multinational framework, as this one has done. A second recommendation, I think it's very important that over the next 25 years, the United States and European Union members bring through Belarusian and Ukrainian elites, historians and others, but bring them through educational institutions and allow them to go back or encourage them to go back. There's no perverse incentive here, by the way, because there's no chance that Belarus and Ukraine are going to join the European Union. So that process that I mentioned about Poland isn't going to happen. But in the meantime, that would at least multiply perspectives. A third thing which Western institutions could do would be to recognize the existence of memory ministries as a phenomenon, just like we recognize the existence of, say, police forces as a phenomenon, and think about how they might be coordinated, right? International policing is coordinated. There's no reason why international memory work, at some very distant level at least, might not be coordinated. So, for example, it would be a very good thing if Polish historians working in the Polish memory ministry and Czech historians working in the Czech ministry and so on spent 1 year at each other's institutions. They would learn languages, they would break out of national frameworks, they would get to know other people. A much more ambitious plan of this sort would have them rotating through the Holocaust Museum in D.C. or Yad Vashem. That's much more ambitious. But what I would point out is that this kind of rotation of cadres, which would freshen up the discussion of what happened in Eastern Europe immensely, would cost almost nothing. The European Union could just spend a few $100,000s a year to finance postdocs or whatever, the condition of which being that you leave your own memory ministry and you spend a year in another. Everyone would profit from that. And it would really do a lot, I think, over the next generations to make these discussions more realistic and fresher. A third thing that we can do, I think, and here I'm following Omar Bartov, an important article he wrote in 2008 in the Journal of Modern History, is to regard the Holocaust, among other things, as an event in East European history. That is, and we should do this for a number of reasons, one of which is because it's just correct. It's where the Holocaust took place. It's where most of the victims lived. But there are other reasons which have to do with commemoration. One of these is this. If you learn East European languages, and sadly Yiddish is an exception, but in general, if you learn East European languages, then you are suddenly in contact with East European historians in a way that you won't be otherwise. And if you start to treat the East European Jews as the central object of your scholarly concern in writing about the Holocaust, you are then embracing East Europeans, right? In other words, you can go through the Ostjuden, who are often not attended to with the kind of detail one would hope, to the other Osteuropäer. You go through the Eastern Jews to East Europeans. Once you are working on Eastern Jews, then you have already started working on Eastern Europe. And that can enable you in all kinds of ways to address other problems of commemoration. The obvious example is talking about tricky things, difficult issues like collaboration. But in general, it would create a situation in which West and East could talk to each other much better. I think the Holocaust divides Western historians from East European historians to a large extent, but it need not. At least in terms of the ability to talk. Which is my final point, and that is that I think if we're going to keep pace with historical discussions in Eastern Europe, if for no other reason, we have to drop the taboo on comparing Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, insofar as anyone believes in it. There are a number of good reasons to drop the taboo. One is that it never really made any sense. If I say to you, you cannot compare... I'm wrapping up, Christian. You cannot compare Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. They're incomparable. I'm issuing a comparative judgment. Because the only way I can say that, and now I am, this is the one sentence I'm repeating from my previous talk. Once I say that, all I have said is, I have compared the two, and I would prefer that you don't, and I have the microphone. It has no other logical content besides that one. The other reason we should abandon the taboo is that when we enforce this taboo, we are denying the experience of Jews and others, because everyone who lived under one regime and suffered, almost everyone who lived under one regime and suffered, had some kind of contact with the other regime. And they were making precisely because the zone I'm talking about, where most of the victims died, is a zone where both powers ruled. Most of the victims, at some point in their lives, even if their lives ended very quickly, had an occasion to think about which regime was better and what one should do. And I don't have time to talk about those occasions, but that is at the heart of the history of the event. The other reason why I think it's important to compare is that if you don't compare, you can't make a judgment about the singularity, or a convincing judgment about the singularity of the Holocaust. I think once you have gone through the other German and Soviet crimes, then you're in a position to talk about the singularity of the Holocaust in a convincing way. If you do not do that, it's going to be very hard to convince East Europeans. And then the final point that I think is important is that if we retreat to a discussion of the Holocaust which relies only on German and is focused on the West, we then drift away from the East European historians, including those who have bad intentions, who talk about the Holocaust in different ways. And there's no contact. There's no way to refute. If we don't learn East European languages and talk about the Holocaust in an East European way, in a comparative context, then we don't know the things that East European historians know, for better and worse. And they're going to be able to dominate the discussion about these things. Okay, last sentence. The original question was the relationship between history and commemoration. What I'm trying to show is that these are two very different things. I think at the very most, the kind of conservative approach to history that I've recommended could place some limits on some of the worst kinds of commemoration, can make it a little bit less unsatisfactory. The paradox of this is that the only way that history can work this way is if we think of it as history rather than as a policy of memory. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. There have been some interesting, provocative ideas. So I'd like you to, if you please, give your name and affiliation and wait for the microphone. We're webcasting this live, so without the microphone, you'll be mum to the rest of the world. So we'll start with the gentleman up in the center there.
Thank you. Stephen Stoltenberg, State Department. You include you include reprisals in your category of deliberate killings.
Reprisals, yeah.
Reprisals in quotation marks. I'm wondering, does that mean then that in your framework you would include reprisals against ethnic Germans, say as the Red Army advances westward and so-called, again, in quotation marks, liberation occurs, bearing in mind that oftentimes these ethnic Germans were actually citizens of, say, pre-war Poland, which had, what, a German minority population, I think, of near 1 million or slightly over. That's the question.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I see things in the following way. To begin with reprisals, in quotation marks. The quotation marks are really important because the Germans did things under the heading of reprisals which were clearly designed for other ends. Given all the things that I was trying to do, I didn't have time to emphasize enough that the Hunger Plan and Generalplan Ost and other German plans provide a kind of legible moral framework within which they go into, for example, Belarus. Belarus was meant to be destroyed to an enormous degree, partly because it wasn't seen as being agriculturally important. Therefore, the destruction in Belarus was meant to be worse even than in Ukraine. And without that understanding of the uselessness, so to speak, of the terrain and its peoples, it's hard to understand how the Germans then proceeded with what they called reprisals. Now, reprisals, and again in quotation marks, can be shown to be a defined policy. We have the orders, we have in terms of the security divisions of the Wehrmacht, in terms of what the police forces were doing, in terms of the general operations of 42, 43, 44. We know that Germans were deliberately doing things like destroying whole settlements, killing women and children in order to get the men to labor. This was done under the heading of reprisal. But in order to understand how seriously one should take that, one has to remember that the heading of reprisal was also one of the most important headings which was used to destroy the Jews. Of course, the policies are different in many ways, but that idea of reprisal has to be understood in this kind of Orwellian sense in order to get it right. Now, I'm saying all that just because I want to emphasize how different reprisal in the Nazi context, with and without quotations, might be. The Warsaw Uprising is similar. In the Warsaw Uprising, in the first 6 days of it especially, the Germans are taking thousands of civilians in areas where there is no combat, putting them against walls or taking them into factories and just shooting them. And they kill, over the course of just a couple of days in August, they kill 40,000 civilians in places where there is no fighting going on. This is a deliberate policy which again is consistent with earlier wartime planning, to which Himmler refers when he orders it, that the city of Warsaw is not to exist in its present form after the war. He tells Hitler that here we have an historic opportunity. Things aren't going so well for us on the battlefield, but here we have an historic opportunity to do something which we have been meaning to do, which is to get rid of the city of Warsaw. And that again is within the framework of reprisals, as the Germans understand it. I say all that just to take the opportunity to be clear about what I mean. Now, with what happens to Germans at the end of the Second World War and thereafter, I would regard that as a consequence of two basic policies. One of them is the German policy not to organize timely evacuations. Hitler has a very clear ideological premise for this, which is that if Germans lose the war, it's their fault. If they've proved their worthlessness as a race, they shouldn't pull back. And the people who are supposed to organize the evacuations, the Gauleiter, are in general old party men, or at least people who hold to this kind of thinking themselves. And for the most part, evacuations from places like Wrocław, which is Breslau, the Baltic region, Pomerania, are organized very tardily or not at all. And that's a distinct German policy, to put your people in the way of harm. Just like it was a Soviet policy not to allow troops to retreat before the Wehrmacht, that put them in the way of harm. And I stress this because there's a kind of interaction here. And then the second policy would be the Soviet policy, or the Soviet laissez-faire attitude about how to treat Germans, which in Soviet propaganda reaches pretty horrible extremes. The idea that Germans are animals and so far, that they stop being human, and this means that perhaps the most tragic part of all this is the huge number of German women who are raped. And it also means that German men are treated as, labor, if they're around at all, which they often aren't because they're fighting or they're already dead. But if they're of any value at all as laborers, they're sent to camps. And many of them are sent to the camps where death rates are highest, mines in Silesia, mines in Ukraine, places like that. But then there's a third factor, of course, which is the Soviet idea, which is shared although there are differences about matters of detail, by the British and the Americans, that ethnic simplicity is going to be the premise for peace after this war. And the Soviets carry out a lot of that with the support of Poles, communist and otherwise, with the support of Czechs, not communist at all. A lot of this is done by fait accompli. But nevertheless, the consensus is that ethnic simplicity is going to lead to peace, and the British and the Americans go along with this at Potsdam. I think that's the third factor which is worth taking into account.
Okay, Jeff Herf.
Wow, that was a lot, and I look forward to reading the book.
Thanks.
I'm going to say some things that you already know. So, if you think about Martin Gilbert's work, Lucy Davidovich, some of the popular histories of the Holocaust.
Microphone, who's speaking?
Then you add to that the disciplines, the histories that have gone on more inside the discipline, Omer Bartov or Jürgen Forster, Gerhard Weinberg. All of that has drawn attention to, in writing about the Holocaust, has drawn attention to the Eastern Front. Yeah. It's very different than Steven Spielberg and the popular history of the Second World War, or the memorial to the Second World War in Washington, which begins with Pearl Harbor and ends a little bit after D-Day. So I think the Holocaust, and even the discussion of Auschwitz-Birkenau, inevitably draws attention to Poland. And it has done that for decades in the historical discipline. The distinction, I think, is less about the Western-centric history about the Holocaust as a scholarly matter. It's a feature of popular culture, and the history of the Holocaust is an element of elite culture among intellectuals and scholars. And it's not the history of the Holocaust of Anne Frank and popular understanding. I know you understand that, but and one iconic moment was this in 1952 when Nahum Goldman stood next to Theodor Heuss in a commemoration in Buchenwald, and Goldman spoke about Bialystok and Treblinka and Auschwitz and all the events of Eastern Europe in this very Western setting.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Let's take it as a comment. Gentleman in the center there, and then up front, I think. Let's take a couple. Let's see, who else had raised there? I think we're just about out of time. Okay, we'll take these three and then give Tim one final opportunity to respond. Okay.
Michael David Fox, University of Maryland. Tim, I've been to both your talks in this room this week, and they've been extraordinarily rich in ideas. In both talks, you've talked about the Ukrainian famine as a deliberate mass killing with an ethnic component, and you're on very strong ground, but you didn't address the question of whether it's a genocide. And that, it seems to me, is clearly modeled on the model of the commemoration of the Holocaust, and perhaps conflates history and commemoration in the way you suggested at the very end might well be separated. And I wonder if you could comment about the issue of genocide in the Ukrainian famine.
Okay, gentleman up front here.
Will Amatrude, Yale alumnus. I'm curious whether you had any discussions with or were influenced by your Yale colleague David Blight, who in his book Race and Reunion discusses the difference between what actually happened in the Civil War and the way the Civil War was commemorated later on, and comes to the conclusion that what the South was really celebrating was the defeat of Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and up there?
Jared Burrell, student of Central European, Russian Eurasian Studies, the University of Maryland.
Can you a little closer?
Jared Burrell, student of, okay, there we go. Central European, Russian Eurasian Studies, the University of Maryland. I just want to touch on something you mentioned at the end when you talked about comparing the USSR with Nazi Germany. I was very curious about how you would recommend beginning a constructive dialogue with a younger generation of Russians, people who grew up listening to their parents' stories and reading what was published in the early 90s, which is debatable. How would you recommend beginning this conversation in a constructive manner which has a possibility for development and breaking down these mental barriers?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay. I'll do it. Jeff Herf, thank you very much for those important references. I completely agree with what you say. The only thing I would slightly stress is that the distinction between popular commemoration and historical scholarship has to allow for a category which is in between, which is the popular book about the Holocaust, the popular history about the Holocaust. And I suspect we would agree that that is somewhere in between. So you can't look at the big successful books about the Holocaust and say they don't talk about the Eastern Front. That would be absurd. I would say, though, that the narrative influence tends to be disproportionately on the West. On the question of whether the Ukrainian famine is a genocide or not, I have a little section about this at the end of the book. It all depends on what you mean. Istvan Deák, in a very thoughtful review of my book, in a coming issue of the New Republic, talks about my discussion of the famine, and he says, Snyder correctly says that it's not a genocide. And what Istvan means in that sentence is an attempt to totally destroy a people. That's his sense of genocide in that sentence. In that sense, he's right. However, that's not the UN definition of what genocide means. And according to the UN definition of the genocide, in which you're destroying a people in whole or in part with intention and so on, I think it's pretty clear that it was a genocide. But I also think a whole lot of other things were. So I don't believe in a single genocide or a double genocide or anything like that thesis. If you look at the UN definition and take it literally, you have to accept that there were a bunch of things. And for what it's worth, Raphael Lemkin, who drafted the definition and came up with the idea, thought that the Ukrainian case, he called it a classic case of Soviet genocide. So I hate to sound wishy-washy, but it really depends on what you have in mind. I think that the famine was not a genocide in the sense in which that word is most often used, namely meaning something like the Holocaust. It definitely wasn't. On the other hand, in the sense that the UN definition provides, I think it probably was. On David Blight and commemoration, that's charming to think about. And you're very much true. It's a very good example, especially because the Civil War was an extraordinarily destructive war. And I would add that what the North commemorates is also the failure of Reconstruction. What the North tends to forget is that that's what created the strong state, and that's a beginning which many Southerners have a problem with. But now I'm really beyond my area of expertise. On the final question of what to do about young Russians and young East Europeans, I wish I had the answer to that. I would stress that this is not just a Russian problem; it's a general problem. It's an American problem too. I think Americans today, as opposed to 1989, have a much weaker grasp of everything we're talking about: the Cold War, the Second World War, the possible exception is the Holocaust, although I'm not sure about even that. The things that I recommended were things like rotation of cadres and postdocs. I don't have any better ideas aside from that. I would say, though, just to close on an optimistic note, that it's definitely not the case that it's impossible to talk to Russian colleagues or young Russian scholars about these things. Provided that you use Russian sources and refer to events that are familiar, you can actually have a conversation. I look forward to that.
Thank you so much, Tim. Let me just to amplify the positive note at the end, say that at the Wilson Center here, we're very fortunate to have the Romanian Cultural Institute support a scholarship program that has in fact brought some young Romanian scholars who are in the memory business here to the center. We've also hosted Pavel Matsevich and others from Poland here repeatedly. So I think you're quite right. There's a lot more that can be done, but together with the Romanian Cultural Institute, we've started to make a small beginning here. We have 10 minutes break. We're resuming at 10:35 sharp. Thank you.